The one that just ended was already unprecedented. Kew Gardens at 35.1 degrees Celsius. The hottest May day in the UK in recorded history by a margin of 2 full degrees. Amber heat health alerts covering every region of England simultaneously. 10 deaths in open water incidents in a single week. 17 deaths in total before the final toll was counted. Reservoirs accelerating toward crisis. Soil moisture deficits deepening on an already parched landscape. An extraordinary event by any historical measure. The kind of event that, in previous decades, might have been separated from the next comparable moment by years or decades of recovery. But the forecasting data that has emerged in the days since the May bank holiday heatwave began to break is not pointing toward years of recovery. It is pointing toward weeks. Because the next heatwave could be coming. And based on the atmospheric pattern, the seasonal forecast, the ocean temperature data, and the climate science that frames all of it, the next one could be worse. The Met Office's deep dive published on June 2nd, 2026, the first day of meteorological summer, was explicit about the direction of the rest of the season. Although summer 2026 has started wetter and fresher than spring 2026 ended, the general signals for summer remain broadly positive, with warm and perhaps very warm conditions expected to return as the summer progresses. That phrase, warm and perhaps very warm, is not an optimistic forecast for beach weather. In the specific context of a summer launching from the most extreme spring on record, with a Super El Niño developing in the equatorial Pacific, with soil moisture deficits across England among the worst in nearly 7 decades, and with reservoir storage levels at critical lows across 5 drought-classified regions, warm and perhaps very warm is a forecast for a second heat event arriving into a landscape that has not recovered from the first. The Independent's reporting confirmed the operational outlook. The UK could face another heat wave in the next 2 weeks as temperatures start to climb towards the 30s once again. WX charts, whose longer range modeling has been tracking the 2026 summer pattern, suggested a second spell of hot weather expected to start from mid-July with temperatures staying in the 30s for multiple days. What made the May event unprecedented was its timing. What will make the next event potentially worse is the accumulated deficit it arrives into. Understanding why the next heat wave could exceed the impact of the one that just ended requires separating the concept of peak temperature from the concept of total impact, because these two things are not the same. The Maybank holiday event produced 35.1 degrees at Kew Gardens, a reading that broke the previous May record by 2 full degrees. But its total human, environmental, and infrastructural impact was shaped not just by that peak temperature, but by the conditions surrounding it. An unacclimatized population, a landscape carrying the driest spring in 132 years, reservoir systems already below their seasonal trigger thresholds, and a health and social care sector activating extraordinary alerts 5 weeks before its core alerting season was due to begin. A second heat wave arriving in July, with temperatures potentially reaching 33 to 35 degrees, not necessarily surpassing May's peak, would land into an environment that has been weakened by the preceding event in every relevant dimension. The population that was physiologically unacclimatized in May will have had some weeks to adjust, but the people most damaged by the first event, the elderly, the chronically ill, those without access to cooling, will be physiologically weaker entering the second. The reservoirs that were at critical lows in May will be lower still after 2 additional months of summer evaporation without adequate recharge. The soil moisture deficit will be deeper. The chalk aquifer levels will have fallen further toward the thresholds at which drinking water supply pressure cannot be maintained. The compounding of a second heat wave on top of a first within the same sum-AR season is not equivalent to experiencing the same event twice. It is an amplified event arriving into an amplified deficit. The attribution science behind why successive heat events within a single summer produce disproportionate harm compared to isolated events has been studied specifically in the context of the UK's 2022 summer, which produced 3 separate heatwave periods across June, July, and August. The 4,500 excess deaths attributed to the 2022 heat periods were not distributed evenly across those 3 events. They were concentrated in the later events, when the cumulative physiological burden on the most vulnerable population, the dehydration, the sleep deprivation from tropical nights, the cardiovascular strain of successive heat exposure, had reduced the physiological reserve available to manage the next acute episode. A person who survives the first heat wave of a summer with their cardiovascular reserves depleted is a materially higher risk person entering the second heat wave than they were entering the first. The LSHTM Imperial College modeling that projected 570 deaths across England and Wales from the 4 peak days of the May 2026 event was calibrated to a population whose prior heat exposure this year was 0. No previous 2026 heat event had occurred before the May bank holiday. The next major heat event of 2026 arrives into a population whose prior heat exposure this year includes the most extreme May on record, with the physiological consequences of that exposure still working their way through the most vulnerable segments of the population. The IB Times UK analysis of the June forecast was precise about the temporal framing. Early signals suggest temperatures may remain slightly above average overall through June, though less extreme than the peak of the heat wave. However, forecasters say the uncertainty remains over whether further hot spells could return later in the month. He met. Office's own language was consistent. Through the second half of next week, and especially the weekend, signs that temperatures will begin to trend up, becoming warm or very warm once again, especially across southern parts, but perhaps more widely as we head toward the middle of July. That language about the middle of July is where the most consequential forecasting signal sits. July is historically the UK's most reliable month for sustained heatwave conditions, the period when the jet stream is at its furthest north, when the Azores High is at its most expansive, when the southerly flow that draws continental air northward has the longest unobstructed reach from the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean basin. A mid-July heat event in 2026 would arrive after 6 additional weeks of summer evaporation from the May heat waves, already depleted hydrological baseline, after 6 additional weeks of demand on reservoir storage systems that are already below, emergency thresholds at sites like Ardingly in West Sussex, and after 6 additional weeks of the El Niño-driven warm and dry tendency that the ECMWF and UKMO systems have identified as the dominant summer 2026 atmospheric signal. The scientists who studied the second 2026 heat wave, the June event that produced 34.7 degrees Celsius at St. James's Park in central London and 33.2 degrees at Charlwood, Surrey, described what they found with a precision that the May event had not previously produced. A study by Met Office scientists revealed that the searing temperatures of the June heatwave were made 100 times more likely because of human-caused climate change. 100 times more likely. Not 10, not 20, not 30, 100 times. That attribution figure surpasses even the 3 times increase in May record exceedance probability that the Royal Meteorological Society's study had established for the specific May temperature threshold. It reflects the specific character of a July season heat wave arriving in the specific atmospheric conditions of 2026, a Super El Niño developing, a global baseline running at 1.46 degrees above pre-industrial, a UK spring confirmed as the warmest and driest in the observational record, and an Atlantic circulation pattern that the deep dive described as broadly positive for warm conditions through the summer. The 100 times attribution finding is not a statement about the normal probability of a June heat wave in the UK. It is a statement about the probability of a June heat wave, of that specific intensity arriving in that specific atmospheric context. And the atmospheric context of summer 2026 is now confirmed as exceptional by multiple independent lines of evidence simultaneously. The water resource emergency that the next heat wave will arrive into is the dimension of the compound impact story that has received the least attention relative to its significance. The Environment Agency's drought status classifications, which placed 5 regions of England in official drought before the May event peaked, will not have been reversed by the largely unsettled start to June. Official drought status requires sustained hydrological recovery across multiple metrics: river flows, groundwater levels, reservoir storage, soil moisture, and the timeline for that recovery runs in months, not weeks. Southeast Water's formal statement that Ardingly Reservoir will not fully recover before the summer demand peak was made in May, before the heat wave accelerated the reservoir's evaporative losses further. The June unsettled weather has brought some rainfall to the affected catchments, but the Environment Agency has consistently documented that very dry soils cause intense downpours to run off rather than soak in, meaning the catchment that fed Ardingly through the May heat wave is not absorbing June rainfall efficiently enough to meaningfully close the storage gap before the next warm spell arrives. A second heat event in July adding another week or fortnight of maximum evapotranspiration to a reservoir that has not recovered from May is a water supply scenario that Southeast Water's hydraulic models will be projecting through their worst-case planning pathways as this is written. The agricultural picture in the same time frame moves from the acute stress of the May event toward the compound stress of a summer where heat episode follows heat episode without adequate recovery between them. Winter wheat, in its grain-filling stage, the critical period damaged by May's temperatures, is approaching harvest across the East Anglian counties that sit inside both the May and the projected mid-July heat wave footprints. A second heat event arriving before harvest creates compound damage on a crop that has already experienced thermal stress, potentially reducing both yield and quality at the precise point when the grain is completing its final development. The NFU will be advising members on harvest timing decisions that are now being made against the most uncertain early summer weather background in the agricultural sector's recent experience. because the choice between harvesting earlier to escape a forecast heat event and waiting for the crop to reach full maturity is a decision with significant financial consequences, and no clearly correct answer in a summer where the next heat wave's timing remains uncertain within a 2 to 4 week window. The National Grid's Energy Demand Management Challenge for the next heat wave will be qualitatively different from the May event in a specific way that is worth understanding. The May event arrived at the end of spring when industrial and commercial electricity demand was running at spring rather than summer levels. A July event arrives during the period when school holidays have begun, when office occupancy is lower than normal, but when residential air conditioning demand, the demand category that has been growing fastest in the UK as mechanical cooling installation rates increase in response to successive extreme summers, reaches its seasonal maximum. The interaction between peak residential cooling demand, lower than normal industrial demand, and the suppressed wind generation that accompanies the stable high-pressure conditions producing the heat wave creates a specific electricity supply challenge that the National Grid's operational planning teams model in advance of each warm event. The June 2026 heat wave that produced 34.7 degrees at St. James Park activated flex alerts, requests for voluntary demand reduction, as the grid managed the demand spike. A July event with comparable temperatures arriving during peak school holiday residential demand could require the same interventions at higher baseline demand, with less industrial flexibility available to buffer the peak. The public health system's capacity to manage a second major heat event within the same summer season is the human dimension of the compounding story that deserves the most direct attention. NHS trusts across the affected regions spent the May heat wave at elevated operational tempo, increased emergency department presentations, staff working through the amber alert period at heightened readiness, resources deployed to heat-related clinical pathways. The physiological dimension of working in a 30 to 35 degree environment adds to the fatigue burden that health system workers carry into the next event, alongside the professional fatigue of sustained high intensity operations. Emergency departments that processed a surge of heat-related presentations in May face a second surge in July with the same staffing levels, the same infrastructure, and the same operational constraints, but with the accumulated fatigue of the earlier event as an additional burden on every individual worker in those departments. The UKHSA Amber Alert that will activate for the next major heat event will trigger the same institutional response frameworks. The question is whether the staff delivering those frameworks are entering the second event with the same capacity they brought to the first. The Met Office's senior scientist, Dr. Gillian Kay's study in the Weather Journal, established that the chance of exceeding 40 degrees Celsius is now more than 20 times more likely than it was in the 1960s, and has almost trebled since the year 2000. She estimated a 50-50 probability of a 40-degree day within the next 12 years. The specific summer of 2026, following the warmest spring on record, with a Super El Niño developing, with the Met Office's own seasonal forecast assigning double the normal probability to a hot outcome, is one of the most thermally primed years within that 12-year window for the probability to manifest. The next heat wave of summer 2026 does not need to reach 40 degrees to be worse than the May event. It needs to arrive with the right combination of duration, overnight, minimum temperatures, soil moisture deficit, reservoir storage gap, and compound physiological burden on the population, all of which are more unfavorable for the next event than they were for the first. The May bank holiday heat wave was unprecedented in what it measured. The next one could be unprecedented in what it costs. The mental health and psychological dimension of successive heatwave events within the same summer season is documented in the academic literature, but almost entirely absent from the public discourse that surrounds individual heat events. Research on eco-anxiety, climate grief, and the psychological effects of extreme weather exposure has established that repeated encounters with extreme weather events within a short time frame produce cumulative psychological burden. Specifically, elevated anxiety, disrupted sleep architecture beyond the direct thermal disruption, increased rates of irritability and interpersonal conflict, and a generalized sense of environmental threat that persists between events rather than resolving when temperatures return to normal. The population that experienced the May bank holiday heat wave, including the families of 17 people who died, the Southeast water customers who quit UED for water bottles, the people who lost vehicles in flash flooding during the amber thunderstorm warnings, and the millions who spent 5 nights in temperatures too warm for restorative sleep, enters June's unsettled interlude, carrying psychological residue from that experience. A second major heat event arriving in July does not find a population psychologically reset to its pre-May baseline. It finds a population that is already carrying the cognitive and emotional burden of what the first event cost, and that must manage the anxiety of knowing the next one is coming, before the current relief has had time to settle into genuine recovery. The Climate Change Committee's 2025 adaptation assessment specifically flagged that the UK's mental health infrastructure, already operating under significant pressure from multiple pre-existing demand drivers, has no specific adaptation framework for the psychological consequences of repeated extreme weather events, a gap that the compound heatwave pattern of summer 2026 is exposing in real time. The fire service and wildfire risk dimension of a second heat wave arriving into the landscape conditions that a first event created is one of the most direct and dangerous compounding effects in the chain. The Maybank holiday heat wave drove grass and vegetation moisture content across southern and central England to levels comparable to mid-August in a historically normal summer. The fire that broke out near Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh during the May event, the elevated operational tempo of fire services across London, the Midlands, and the southeast throughout the Amber Alert period, all of these reflected a landscape that had been dried to fire risk conditions weeks ahead of when those conditions would gnaw. The June thunderstorm breakdowns that followed the heat wave brought lightning before rainfall in multiple locations, creating the dry lightning ignition risk on drought-stressed vegetation that fire services monitor most urgently. By the time July arrives, the vegetation that has experienced May's record heat, June's partial drying and lightning exposure, and the continued below-average soil moisture of a Super El Niño summer will be in conditions that the historical fire risk models classify as extreme fire danger territory. The London Fire Brigade, which recorded a 32% increase in water-related incidents in the period preceding the May heat wave, will be managing both the water safety risk and the fire risk simultaneously as the second heat event develops. These are not separate operational challenges. They are concurrent demands on the same finite emergency service resources, in the same geographic areas, during the same peak weeks of a summer that is producing the worst compound fire, and flood conditions that British fire services have managed in the modern operational era. The infrastructure fatigue story that sits beneath the public-facing weather narrative is the one that determines how well the systems supporting 56 million people in England hold together across a summer of compound heat events. Network Rail's heat management protocols, speed restrictions, thermal monitoring, engineered interventions on vulnerable track sections were designed and calibrated for a UK summer that historically produced one or two significant heat events per season at most. The 2022 summer produced 3 heatwave periods. The 2025 summer produced 4. If the 2026 summer follows the pattern that the Super El Niño, the broadly positive seasonal signals, and the IB Times June forecast are pointing toward an unsettled June interlude followed by a return to very warm conditions in July, the rail network will be managing its 3rd or 4th significant heat stress period of the summer in conditions where the pre-existing maintenance and inspection backlog from the preceding events has not been fully cleared. Infrastructure that has experienced repeated thermal cycling, the expansion and contraction of continuously welded steel through multiple heat events, accumulates fatigue damage at a rate faster than planned maintenance cycles can address. Parliamentary evidence from Network Rail confirmed that the number of service-affecting heat-related failures could be 4 to 5 times more frequent by the 2050s. The 2026 compound summer is giving the network an early preview of that future frequency within a single calendar year. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stated in response to the 2025 European heatwave sequence that extreme heat is no longer a rare event. It has become the new normal. That assessment was made before summer 2026's opening act delivered the hottest May day in UK history at 35.1 degrees, triggered amber alerts across all of England simultaneously for the first time in the alert system's history, produced 17 deaths in open water incidents in a single week, and forced Southeast water customers to queue for bottled water at distribution points in June. The summer that follows the opening act, the summer of a second heat wave confirmed to be 100 times more likely because of human-caused climate change of 34.7 degrees at St. James's Park, of deeper reservoir deficits, of compounding physiological burden, of wildfire risk, conditions developing weeks ahead of the historical seasonal calendar of infrastructure entering its 3rd or 4th significant thermal stress event of the year, is the summer that will determine whether the new normal has a ceiling or whether the ceiling keeps rising with each event that exceeds the one before it. The Maybank holiday heat wave was unprecedented in what it measured at the monitoring stations, what it measured at the human level, in the 17 open water deaths, in the thousands of people queuing for water, in the 570 projected excess heat deaths, in the amber alerts that activated for an entire country simultaneously. It was the cost of an unprecedented atmospheric event landing on an unprepared landscape. The next heat wave is coming. The landscape will be less prepared for it than it was for May. And the direction of every piece of evidence relevant to that question points the same way.